Hi, everyone, and welcome to what has been pointed out to me. It's not only the last Criminology Forum speaker of the semester, it's the last one in this room before we blow up the building. So no pressure, but it's gonna be a big one. So I'm very excited today to have JC Barnes here. I don't know if many of you know this, but he was my very first grad student ever out of grad school when I started at the University of South Carolina. And they say your success is when the student outperforms the teacher. So I must be very successful, because when I was reading his CV to try to prepare his introduction, I think I lost count at 1 million articles. I was literally up to over 150 and feeling very bad about myself. He's very well published in top journals. He has a couple different themes to his research. He's very prominent in the biosocial aspect of criminology and has worked with leaders there. He's also working on decision-making, how offenders perceive risk. And I think that's what he's going to be talking to us more about today. And he's very, I'm going to say it wrong again. He's active in the Dunedin study in New Zealand, which has over 1,000 people. Over 900 are still in it since 1972. 1972. So it's one of the first long-term longitudinal studies to look at how crime evolves over the life course. So he's also an expert in life course criminology, and he's written 5 books, multiple grants. I don't know, life on Mars. Is there anything you haven't done yet? Great. So I'm very excited he agreed to come speak to us today, and I'm very excited that you all came to hear him. Thank you for coming to our last speaker series and the last lecture in the room. No hats.
Well, thank you. So as Megan said, the last part with the Dunedin study, so that's going to feature in the talk today. Got a couple of I'm going to kind of combine a couple of studies, so at least 2, and there might be like kind of hints of a third. But what I really like about these kind of things is rather than just presenting like one paper, I can kind of present to you the thread of an argument or thread of an idea that I have been pursuing. And so it'll look like, this is really for the students and postdocs in the room. The mistake would be to assume like I did these and they were like all came together really quickly, when in fact this is like 8 years worth of work that's going to go by in about 30 minutes. So keep that in mind as you're developing your careers. And then also the Dunedin study that Megan mentioned. So I've this is another good lesson, is that I've just basically forced myself on them, and like all the pro-social ways of that. And I just keep showing up basically, and they're like, okay, well, you can be a part of the team. And so that's also a good lesson for like, if you want something, like just go and go visit and go make friends. Most people in our discipline in the science community are quite social, and they will appreciate it. So all right, so we'll get right in. So we're going to look at mainly the feature today. The focus is going to come out of a little bit of a niche interest that I had probably over the last 10 years. This is not, I think if we look back over my career, if anyone ever was to do that when I'm long gone, I think this will be like just like a minor blip of what I've done. I think most people say, yeah, biosocial is kind of my area, and I'm quite proud of that. But this has actually just been one of those things that I've always had interest in, always like read like everything in our field that would come out on perceptual deterrence, the formation of our perceptions more broadly, so getting into psychology, personality research, behavioral economics, and I was just always just interested in that and didn't really know how I might contribute. And then I started to really get into and started thinking about the rational choice model and where perceptions play in there, and how do we form our perceptions of risk. And that turns out to, I think it's fair to say, still a fairly wide open area. There's some good literature, or there's some good articles out there on it, but it still has a lot of room for a lot to learn. And so then you combine that with the Dunedin study, as I mentioned earlier, they've been collecting data on these people since 1972. They're 52 now. They're collecting data again this year. And I was studying their old questionnaires, the old code books, and realized they had been asking about perceptions of risk since the participants were 18. And so we've got this like incredibly rich data source, and you're not in these items that aren't often asked in our standard surveys. And so I started kind of putting all that together, and we were able to. I think this is probably one of the studies I'm most proud of, especially recently. Put together a really interesting study of trying to understand how our perceptions form early in life, and then how they change over the life course. This will be the third lesson I'll give you before I get in to the study. This is also probably the study where I was wrong the most. So almost all of my a priori hypotheses turned out to be wrong. But we had pre-registered the result or the ideas. And so we're still able to get it published in a really, really great place. And I think it still makes a contribution. So with all that being said, you can see the title here, using risk of crime detection, study mechanisms and decision-making. So there's really going to be two things. We can kind of jump to here. So, because I've already said we're looking at perceptions of risk. Really the two main questions that are driving this, and I'm realizing I told you I was going to stand over here, but now I'm more comfortable here. So should I move the camera? Am I out of frame mostly?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
So I don't know if he's on there, but Eric Balmer said he was going to tune in. I want him to be able to see me. So, if he is on, I hope he appreciates that. So the two main questions would be, what's the impact of criminal justice contact on youth misbehavior? But we're going to tie that in with what that contact is and what the impact it has. Does that work through changing the perceptions of risk of getting in trouble, or is it something else? And then we'll lead into the second thing, which is what affects our perceptions of detection risk. And so again, hopefully I'll make the connection clear between the two. So the first one, this is the study that I'll pull the results from, but this actually started, we're really interested in kind of that basic question of you can pit kind of deterrence and labeling theory against one another. And it's one of the few instances that I know of in our field where you've got these two really really well studied, well thought out predictions, explanations, theoretical propositions, but they make exactly opposite predictions about what should happen from the same event. So the event being you come into contact with the system, you get arrested, whatever it is. Deterrence says that should make it less likely that you'll commit crime in the future, right? And there's all these mechanisms that might explain why that would happen. And then labeling says the exact opposite. You come into contact with the system, and then it makes it more likely that you'd go on to commit future, secondary deviance. So same thing, different outcomes. So we thought, and then we're not the first to think this, of course, but we had this really interesting, rich data source that thought we could really put together a strong test of this, to kind of pit these two against one another. And that data source is the e-risk study, and it's a study of twins in the United Kingdom. It's a longitudinal study. They have been following these twins. They actually are collecting another round of data now. I think they're in their early 30s now. But the year we're going to study is around the kind of early or late teenage years. I think they're 18 is when we're measuring the outcomes. But these are actually IRBs are a little bit different, or at least they were then. These are actually some of the participants, and we're allowed to show that. They've given permission to show some of their faces. So there's a couple of the twins that are in the data set. Here's just some basic demographics of the sample. It's a little over 1,000 pairs, so a little over 2,000 participants. They're all same sex. The pairs are same sex. We do have a mixture of boys and girls, but there's always a boy or a girl pair. They really map up well. It wasn't intended to be perfectly nationally representative, but it was drawn from a larger nationally representative study, the TED study that I believe Robert Plomin is the PI on that originally. So these are kind of a subset of that original study. and the demographics still match up really well with UK demographics. So we reasonably these are representative. You can see the breakdown of things here, males, females, MZ to DZ. And the key here, though, sorry, they don't perfectly match up the national representation, but because they were meant to be a high risk sample, but they match of the people in that demographic kind of slice. The kids, everything else matches up. That's what I meant to say. So kind of conditional on having been high risk. So you can see some of the different things that kind of defined what made them high risk. That some of them born to young moms, living in low income households, or exposure to so mental health challenges, which this is actually quite low compared to some of the more recent stuff we know about the prevalence of mental health challenges. Okay, so here's the kind of this put us all right on the key piece of information from this study. So skipping all the filler. Our model was essentially looking at when you come into contact with the criminal justice system as a youngster in the UK, what happens later? So we're studying, I believe they were 15 here. So we said if they had come into contact with the system by the time they were 15 or so, no, sorry, it was 18, because then, yeah, we had the outcome data at 18. So if they'd come into contact with the system 18 or younger, and then studying their deviant behavior after that. And we had a couple of different ways of measuring it, the self-report, kind of standard stuff like we're used to in criminology. We also have official records that we had pulled to study this as well. But the difference, rather than just studying if I got arrested, what was my behavior later on, we took advantage of the twin structure of the data set. So kind of the natural experiment of the twin subsample and comparing the differences between two twins in the same family. So this wasn't just that if you get arrested, how much more likely are you compared to the rest of the sample? It was when one twin gets arrested, how different is their behavior compared to their co-twin? And that's a really key difference in my opinion, because if this were just a standard kind of multivariable regression, we'd have to control for, you all are being trained on this, or we know this, like you got to control for anything you think is a confounder. And we did, but by design, it also controls out a lot of other confounding that we couldn't directly measure. So in my opinion, at least, it's one of the stronger designs you can use in terms of social science, without being able to do a true experiment on something like this. So these are just a couple. We ended up running it, as you would imagine, a whole bunch of different ways, and every time the coefficient came out positive. And so that was consistent, more consistent with the labeling argument than the deterrence, just the way things were coded. So it's saying the twin who came into contact with the system was had more involvement in deviance later compared to their co-twin. And we even dug in and tried to make sure it wasn't some sort of event where it's like sort of secondary deterrence for their co-twin, like that they didn't really change their behavior, but their co-twin was involved in less deviance. It wasn't that. It was more consistent with the simpler explanation. So these are just the kind of the range coefficients we saw compared to, got more strict or less strict in terms of covariates and design. The key, though, apprehension makes crime more likely in the future would be the very short, brief way to explain what we found in that study. So the question then is that fully attributable to the labeling process? Could be. And in fact, if you were to read that paper, that's kind of the argument that we made. So that's where I'm saying the benefit of being able to do a talk like this, I can pretend that, oh, this led right into this other thing. When in fact there were kind of two separate studies that then started to, in my mind, started to blend. So it could be that it's fully labeling, or it could be that getting in trouble as a youngster, perhaps that lowers your perception of the risks of crime. So the experiential hypothesis, right? Like you get in trouble, and maybe that makes, the one argument would be makes you adjust your perceptions upward, thinking that it's more likely to get in trouble in the future. Or it could be this sort of backfire effect, right? Like, oh, the gambler's hypothesis, right? Like I'm not gonna or gambler's fallacy. It can't happen again, right? I've used up my bad luck. Maybe now I turn that down. So that leads to then I kind of zoom back out. That led me to start to think, well, then where do these perceptions of risk come from? What affects them? Is it as simple as actually coming in contact with the system and then you adjust your perceptions along the way? Or is it more complicated? Are there other things that go into the perceptions of risk that we all have? And so this led to the second paper. This is the one, this was more recently published. And again, for the students and postdocs who may not have been through the unfortunate experience that all the professors in the room will all know all too well. This is one of those papers that it really took like 6 years of just shopping it around journals. Maybe some of you in here were reviewers on it, and I hope if you were that we took your feedback and you were happy with the adjustments we made. If not, don't tell me. So, but no. So this one we did actually send it to criminology journals and got a lot of really good feedback, but it ended up getting published in a Psych journal, as you can see here. I don't know if you could see the journal title. It doesn't really matter, but be happy to share it with anyone who wants to read the study. This one I'm not on, but this was a key development piece for my thinking around this paper and at least fixing it kind of squarely in the criminology literature. Dan's paper on deterrence, criminal opportunities, and police. There's a lot of really great stuff in that paper, but one piece in particular caught my attention and I was really fascinated by and kind of sparked a lot of this. So this is the quote from their paper. They say, "We specify a model of criminal behavior in which ceteris paribus, an offender's decision to victimize a target depends on the target's attendant PA." I like to just quote that because I could never have written anything that sounds that fancy. But because what I would have said is like we are the likelihood that you're going to offend depends on the likelihood that you're going to get in trouble, or how likely it is you think you'll get caught. And that doesn't sound nearly as good. But that's basically what they're saying. And they put together this balancing equation that explains that decision-making calculus, right? Or the mathematical formula of that decision-making calculus. So you've got the gains of crime, and then you just subtract out of that all the risks and the costs of doing crime. And when you do that, and we're believed to be doing this in our mind to some crude extent. I think that's probably true. We're not solving this exactly, but we're using our heuristics and our biases and other things that we've learned along the way throughout our life to kind of balance this equation all the time, really, and a lot of things in life. So I think this makes sense. So you got the perceived benefits of crime, you take away from that all the perceived risks and costs, and if that is bigger than some other threshold, then it basically is more likely that you'll do the thing versus not do the thing. So this is kind of our basic rational choice model in essence. But central to this equation is the perception of apprehension risk. That's what this stands for. And it kind of multiplied across in the equation. So it's a multiplier. So like you adjust this and everything it can change like in a really big way, which makes it really, I think, really interesting from that perspective, because if we can adjust this just a little bit, it could translate into big changes in behavior on a large scale. So there's a lot of really, a lot of really important outcomes potential here. So that raises the question, where does PA come from? What is it? And what changes it? we thought about it through a developmental lens, given the data that we had, the people that I was collaborating with, the type of work that I've done in the past. Wasn't just thinking about it as where does PA come from in any one instance. It's more of like where does your general baseline level of perception of risk come from? Do we all just have the same? Do we all just start at like 50%, 50-50? Or do we vary? And if we vary, why do we vary? So that's kind of what I mean here. And then we start thinking about, well, this gets really complicated because there isn't just one type of crime that we can commit, right? we know, of course, it can break down into all sorts of buckets, like even down to the individual crime type. And so that raises the question, do we hold a perception for every type of crime that you might be able to commit? Or do we kind of generalize these things? Can we cluster them, so to speak? For the methodologists in the room, basically this lends itself to like kind of factor analysis, what essentially we're going to do. Does the data fit better as just treat everything as a separate entity, a separate item, or can we bunch these together and still make sense of this information? The developmental part of it, does this change over time? Does the level of perception of risk that we have, say, in our teenage years, does that follow through and carry through the adult portion of life? And then are they formed rationally? Does it correlate to the actual risk that prevails in the environment? Or are there other pieces of information that might on paper look like that shouldn't actually affect your perception of risk, but it does? So is it formed essentially like every other human characteristic with biases, with heuristics? So those were our three kind of guiding things, and those translated into 4 specific hypotheses. And this is where I was getting at that. Turns out I was wrong on a lot of this, so a little bit of a spoiler, but I'll walk you through and show you exactly which ones I was wrong on. So the first hypothesis was, I tried to just give it a name that would make it easy to remember, rather than just hypothesis 1. So called it the global factor hypothesis. And it basically is what I said earlier. We're going to look to see, we've got a couple of different crime types that we've got measures for. So we're going to look to see, do they stand alone or do they correlate? Are they part of a more general perception? Then the next one's the age-graded hypothesis. We got really rich data that covers about 20 years of the life course. We don't have 20 data points, unfortunately. We had 4, but it covers a long span. So we can still make use of it and see, do people change over time, or is it a flat line? So we'll assess that. And this one I still can't think of a better way to describe it. I hated this term, but they call it the cost risks hypothesis. So trying to get at that last piece of, is it purely the actual information, the actual risk information that drives your perceptions, or do other things like the cost of crime affect your perception of the risks of crime? Because they're 2 different things. You even go back to the Nagin equation earlier. The costs and the risks are 2 separate pieces of that equation. They can be correlated. I'm not sure that that's necessarily that doesn't detonate that equation, but they are treated as separate things, and so I'm curious whether that holds up. And then finally, this one's actually a kind of old hat for criminologists, the experiential hypothesis. When we get arrested, will people adjust upward their risk, their perception of the risk of getting arrested? Deterrence theory kind of necessitates this, or at least leans on this and assumes like, yeah, you get arrested, people are going to then think the risk, or at least they're not going to adjust them downward like we saw potentially in that first paper. Okay, so introduce you now a little bit to the study, the data that Megan mentioned, the one that I said I've just basically keep showing up, and they've allowed me to use the data and kind of be the essentially their resident pro bono criminologist in a lot of ways. So for those, if you're not familiar with New Zealand, chances are, even if you are, you're probably not familiar with Dunedin. It's on the South Island, kind of on the bottom tip of the country. Pretty much nothing between that and Antarctica, which makes for some really interesting weather patterns, actually. I like to show this too, because even people who are familiar with New Zealand, there's a non-zero portion of the population that thinks New Zealand's in Europe. So I like to confirm that it is not in Europe. You do have to cross the whole Pacific Ocean, and it takes a long time to get there. So we're basically up here, kind of where the red dot is. So it's about a 30-hour travel time to get there. Usually about 3 different airports that you'll visit. So you got to be committed to go. Here's just kind of the really rough structure of the study itself. So 1972, the design it started out as a study of early child development, and they wanted to essentially study every kid that was born in the Dunedin Hospital in 1972, spanned over the first couple of months or so into 1973. We can't see it, but it's a little over 1,000 kids were enrolled in that first phase of the study. They followed up with them at age 3, and you can see they got everybody. Retention rate was 100% that first kind of follow-up. I don't remember where the original study was intended to stop. I want to say it was age 5, but it was one of these first couple follow-ups. The original proposal was we'll follow them for first 5 years or 7 years, whatever it was. And then so it wasn't intended to be this way from the very beginning. This is another nice lesson about a scientific career, that it's just a lot of continued work. I can't take credit for any of this. I'm just sort of taking advantage of all of it, but a lot of people that committed to this and finding new things to continue to interest the funders, and a lot of this was funded by the New Zealand government. But one thing to point out here is what you're seeing in this column. For those in the room, this is the number of participants who came back and were re-interviewed, and then this is just the percentage. The percentage here is adjusted for the number of living participants, essentially. So if you did the math here, that's actually not quite 94%, but it's 94% of those who are still living, which I think is just quite remarkable, to have at least 45-year study where you're getting 94% of living participants to return. You might then think, oh, it's because it's New Zealand, it's so beautiful, no one leaves. That turns out it's not all the case. About 2/3 of the participants have moved off, not just out of Dunedin, but away from New Zealand. About half of those are in Australia, so it's a relatively relatively convenient track. But a good portion of them have moved to America or Europe. And the study is so well funded that they pay to bring them back. So they don't just do a phone interview with these. For participants who are incarcerated or in other way, in any other sense incapacitated, they will send a interviewer to them. So there's just a monumental effort. It's really just quite amazing. So I'll show you then the measures that we're using, or that I'm using in this study. So the key one here is the perceived detection risk. That term, I had been using perceived arrest risk, which is really what it is, but we kind of generalized it. Again, maybe one of you in the room had suggested, as a reviewer suggested it. I thought, I actually do like that term. So we pulled it up a little bit. Here's the prompt that all the participants saw. Now I'll ask you about the chances of getting caught for some activities. If you did, and then they're going to show them a couple different crimes. So just sort of a placeholder. If you did this crime on 10 different days, how many times do you think that you would get caught for that crime? There's an interesting way of asking this question. To us, people who are quite comfortable with statistics and numbers, we probably would have said, what do you think the odds are? What's the percentage chance? Or what's the risk? There's a lot of easier ways we probably would have said this. Turns out that way of asking the question was pilot tested before it was used in the survey. And it turns out that most people in the kind of general population weren't comfortable with that. They're like, I don't know what that means. They didn't understand what we meant when we said, what's the percent of time that you would get arrested? That was what they're getting hung up on. And any basic survey design would say, you don't want the participant getting hung up on the wrong part of the question, right? And they're getting hung up on that. So we found that this was something they were quite comfortable with. Or they found, again, this was before my time with it. So what they did, they asked them this, and then rather than just saying and asking them to remember the number, they had kind of stretched out on the table the cards with 0 through 10 on it. And they just asked them to point, to which card. So lowering that burden on the survey participant as much as you can. Here are the focal crime types. So there were 8 crime types that they asked. So they got asked this question 8 times. You can see them here. So shoplifting, car theft, these are the exact words that were used in the survey. Shoplifting, car theft, burglary, fraud, marijuana use, assault, driving under the influence, and domestic violence. You'll see in a minute, we don't have data on all of these at every wave. That'll make sense in one of the upcoming slides. I'll explain. So now we're getting into those kind of independent right-hand side of the equation variables. What predicts the things we just saw? So we have measures on perceived detection costs, and we've got a couple of different focal points for that. First is mainly on social bonds here, but we got 2 different types of social bonds. We're going to ask them about the costs to their relationships with their friends, and also the cost of their relationships with their family. So the idea is, and you're going to see the question wording says something like, would you lose the respect and good opinion of your friends or family? So two separate questions. If they knew you, and then we said had done those things that we just asked them about on the previous slide. So the crime types match up perfectly and they're consistent between these questions, which is a really nice design. This is very well thought out. And so the idea is trying to get at that, if you remember from the Nagin equation, that the cost piece was in there. Like what would be the implications if you get caught for doing this? Not just the risk of getting caught, but what would happen if you got caught? Would you lose some of these connections? We're going to measure convictions to get that experiential hypothesis by actually pulling their official records from New Zealand and Australia. We'd searched, they kind of searched every time they did data collection. And so we stopped this study at the age 38 phase. So we've got conviction data all the way up to age 38, essentially. Here's that kind of the blue slide from a second ago, kind of lay it on its side just to show you where we got measures from. So we're going to kind of aggregate a measure of childhood socioeconomic status to capture that first decade and a half or so of the life course to adjust for that. These are some of the control variables, some of the covariates that we're going to adjust for. So peer delinquency, self-perception is an interesting one. I'll just say quickly, it's just basically their perceived level of involvement in crime compared to their friends. If we have time at the end, I'll kind of come back to it. That's a new thing that I'm working on. It's a really interesting measure I've never seen in any other data set. The short version is, turns out everyone thinks they're below average. And then in terms of the amount of crime they commit, even the people who are committing a whole lot of crime think that they're below average. So it's really kind of cool. Offending variety, so their actual involvement in crime. And then this would be one of our key predictors, convention, and then perceived detection costs. So that you can kind of see the dates and the phases that we had measures. Our outcome we had measured at 18, 21, 26, and 38. And then you can see that's what the lines are showing, where we had these other measures from. This is not a twin sample. This one is a population, or was drawn from the general population. So all singletons. As far as I know, there might be a couple of sibling pairs in there, but there's not enough to like adjust for to be able to do like a sibling study. There was actually one set of siblings in the study. They're kind of I don't know if this is necessarily an insult, but like where I'm from, we call them Irish twins. So kids that were born within a year of each other, but were separate births. And mom had said, you can have one of them, but not the other in the study, because I can't come back to Dunedin like all the time. You know, you can study one of them, you get to pick which one. And so I think they just randomly flipped for which kid was going to be enrolled in the study. But what that means for the methodologists and statisticians, like this is going to all just turn into kind of standard regression modeling rather than taking advantage of the natural experiment. Okay, so checking the time, I think we're good. So now getting into the fun stuff. So this is going to be kind of the first preliminary glimpse into that developmental hypothesis, the age-graded hypothesis. So just sticking with the very first crime type, shoplifting. I'll walk you through what you're seeing here. It's not all that complicated, but then I'll reveal all of them, so it doesn't overwhelm you. On the y-axis here, remember that we had originally asked them 0 through 10, the number of days you think you'd get arrested. Just turn that into a fraction, a proportion. So we can now translate it, kind of interpret it as a risk, as a probability value, essentially. So 0.5 means that they said 5 out of 10 days, right? So it's roughly half of the time you think you'd get arrested if you did this. So the black line here is the sample average, the kind of the line of best fit, your regression line. The black dots are the actual sample average at each phase. So you can kind of see it's pretty tight, pretty well-fitting line, at least for those 4 time points. Couple observations. One, at age 18, most people are saying it's about a 50-50 chance that you get arrested if you shoplifted, which is interesting in and of itself. There's some interesting information there. my hypothesis based on like developmental criminology was that this was essentially going to be the peak, and that as people aged, the line would start to come down. Start thinking about the age crime curve, right? Like maybe that's what's going on, that people are perceiving more risk as they age, and so they're doing less crime. As you can see, it turns out that couldn't have been more wrong. That the line's trending slightly up. I'm sorry. So I would have anticipated to go up, and then therefore the age crime going down. But still, it ticks slightly up. You're going to see the rest of them are pretty flat. So it's basically no evidence in favor of that. The gray lines you're seeing here were 20 randomly drawn participants and then their individual trajectories over time. And I always like to do things like this exercise. Sometimes it doesn't make it into a paper, but I think it's just it's a nice reminder for me that these are real people. These are people's lives. They've lived, they have experiences that are forming their answers. And this reminds us that people are quite variable, right? There's a lot of variation in the population. And so you see it both in the trajectories and the changes that they experience over time. You also see it in like where they start out, right? A lot of intercept variance there for the multi-level people, right? So that if we only look at this black line, we say like, wow, this is pretty stable. Wow, it's nice and clean data. But that hides a lot of that really interesting variance. Here it is for car theft. So they think it's more likely that you're going to get arrested, but they basically don't change over time. They think it's a little less risky to do. I can't see what this one was. I forget the order here. Burglary. A little less risky to do burglary, but again, still they don't really change over time. Still a lot of individual variation. Fraud, a little higher. And then just reveal the others all in one panel. Marijuana, quite low. Assault, a little bit higher. DUI, domestic violence. So you can see now, I mentioned earlier, we didn't have all the measures at all the phases. They added these three at phase 21, so there's no phase 18 information. And then the domestic violence is added at 26, and I have two data points for that. So that's why the graphs look a little different. One thing that we did not propose this as a formal hypothesis, but once I started looking at the data, I realized that like, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. It's consistent with another hypothesis, I guess I'd call it, from you probably situate it in the behavioral economics literature, called coherent arbitrariness, which just means that in this case, it would mean that people actually aren't all that well in tune with the actual risks of this, but they can kind of rank order them correctly. We didn't ask them to do that, but you can kind of see it here that they know marijuana is not really risky. And so they appropriately said that's really low risk. And the things that are higher risk, they've actually given higher risk, but they're quite off in the objective risk level. So if we were to just sort of say how accurate are they, they're quite wrong. But they could put them in the right order, which isn't nothing, right? Like that's interesting to tell. There is some information informing this. Okay, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Shouldn't the individual plot be zigzag, or are you just looking at the first and last?
So this was like an individual, so basically like a regression line for an individual. Yes. So if it had just been the actual information, absolutely, it was all over the place. But yeah, just take each person. Has had 4 data points here. Kind of this one makes sense. But just what was their general trajectory per person? Yeah, great question.
Since we're
Of course.
it does look like for some of these, you might have 2 groups of people. One that goes up, one that goes down.
Yeah.
Only for
Yeah, especially
someone
like that's
who has
kind of,
a
yeah, you can see you can bunch them here.
And then if you're not measuring that, you
Mhm.
could see like a canceling effect, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I have not looked into that. There's a lot of crude ways we could do that. Of course, you could do like some sort of latent profile modeling or trajectory or something, which would be incredibly interesting. I had not thought about that before. So absolutely, that's a great point. Yeah.
It was the reviewer on the paper.
Yeah, exactly. I wish you had been, because no one ever brought that up. So yeah, that's great. Okay, we should talk about that.
Some ideas about why.
Okay. So I have a student doing a dissertation on, essentially this kind of first phase, and then taking some of the information from prior in the life course trying to understand why that initial variance. So we are still like digging in on this. We could look into that. Great. Anyone else? I don't mind the interruptions at all. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess little change.
Mhm.
I wonder if because you're sort of holding constant the frequency, right? It's like you're spending 10 days.
Yes.
Over time, like with the age time curves, if you just ask sort of a broad.
Yeah.
the probability
Yeah.
rested, you would factor sort of
You
the
might-
frequency in there.
Mhm.
Here you're holding that constant.
That's a really interesting point. So maybe it could be a little bit of a survey artifact, a survey kind of question artifact, essentially. Certainly can't rule that out. Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to the pause. I'm trying to think other ways to measure it because we have the option not with phase 52, but there is likely to be at least one more phase of data collection for this study after phase 50. We don't know exactly when yet, but maybe age 56 or something. And could propose to either put these questions back on. They took them off at age 38, so that's why we stopped there. But either propose to put these back on, or if we could think of a better way to measure it too, getting around some of this. So I'd certainly be open and interested to hear ideas. Okay, so the next thing, so that was just our preliminary glance. I'm going to do a formal latent growth curve analysis in one of the next slides, but it doesn't tell us much different than what you saw there. The first formal test of one of these hypotheses was the kind of general factor hypothesis. So this, as you can imagine, this is the simplest way of showing you that we did like every type of factor analysis you could think of with all the covariant structure fit implications you could think of. Didn't matter. The results come out substantively the same way every time, which is everything loaded positively on a general factor. Yes, for some phases we could see a little bit of evidence of a second factor, but then it wasn't consistent across the phases. Everything loaded positively for the most part, especially these first four, which were the ones that we measured consistently. They had fairly robust loading. These are standardized path loadings. It's kind of small. I mean, this is a 0.5 was the lower end for that one, 0.47. We noticed that these tended to load it a little bit lower, with a little bit lower coefficients, especially domestic violence. Almost always was an outlier that it never fit better on a second factor, but it was like it was the outlier. It didn't really fit well with anything else. There might be some substantive, easy to understand implications there or explanations. But for the most part, everything said, yeah, that you can capture this fairly well with one latent factor. One thing that was interesting that I didn't anticipate is when this was eventually published in a psych journal, we were getting reviewed by people who are more familiar and comfortable with like the personality literature. They're used to seeing loadings of like 0.8 and above and model fit statistics that are like perfect, right? Like these things fit really, really well. And so I don't know who they were, but they gave us just enough grace to like get it, convince the editor like, okay, this is fine. But that was part of our argument. We didn't use that exact point, but we did say, this is the first pass at measuring some of these things, right? Like there's a lot of measurement error in here. And these aren't just clean personality traits. And in fact, that's the whole point. We didn't know if they could be measured as, kind of considered one thing. But in general, it looks like, yeah, you've kind of got a general sense of the risk of getting arrested that you carry around with you in this from scenario to scenario. And I like to think of it as like you got this baseline, and then if you were to say like walking down the street considering doing any given crime, you kind of adjust off of that baseline. So it's sort of like your anchor again in like the behavioral economics literature. I think that's part of the implications of this. Okay, and then lastly, and then we'll start to wrap up here. Putting everything together, kind of test all the other hypotheses all at once in this multi-level model. So we got our intercept here and then our time variable. time was measured as a count and it corresponded to age, and it was centered at 0. So the intercept is the average, the sample average perceived risk at phase 18, and then this is the change for every year of age that we saw the sample on average building in. So it is positive, which was consistent with my hypothesis, but that is a very minor, uptick for every given year. Now, over the course of 40 years, it's like, okay, that might not be inconsequential. But what this is telling me essentially is like, that's not why the age crime curve, is falling off in the 20s. It's not because we're getting really risk averse all of a sudden. There may be a slight kind of increase in risk aversion over time, but it's not translating to our perceptions of the arrest risk. Only about a 4% increase over a 20-year period. Here now looking at the between person differences. So time, like studying the whole time phase at once. So just on average, the between people differences. We see that people who perceived more costs to their family, so they thought that their family members would be like disown them if they got arrested, essentially, they were more likely to, they reported slightly higher perceived risk of arrest on average. They didn't see anything for the friends here, but then that flips. The opposite was true at the between time, or the time varying effect, which to me suggests like maybe there's probably not a whole lot here. There's maybe a little bit of substance we can draw, but you'd like to see these be consistent across the two levels. And once again, this isn't a huge effect. So what this is saying is, for someone who perceives more cost to their friends, or they're more likely to lose friends if they get arrested, they adjust slightly upward their perceived risk of arrest over time, and this is time variable, so there is variation in it that can change over time. So you start to think, well, like, what might that mean? Yeah, and I actually thought at the time varying one would be family. You think about like having kids and things like that, and that's what I thought people would be thinking about, but it turns out they're not. The time varying one shows up for the friendship level. And then lastly, so the third coefficient here was the conviction. This is the experiential hypothesis. It is positive. You see no star here because we were pretty strict on the 0.01 criterion, but it came in at like 0.012 or something like that. And this journal was strict enough. They wouldn't even allow me to put like a note in that it was marginally. They said, take all that out, which is fine. I respect that. But like, I would call this like this was close enough. Like, yeah, this isn't running against all the literature that we have in criminology. Okay, so closing things down, imploding the building, so to speak. So we did see people don't seem to hold unique perceptions for each crime. So if we're like sort of wipe off all of the messiness and the very simple conclusions here, smooth over all the noise. Doesn't look like we have unique perceptions for each crime. Rather, there may be a general or a baseline perception or risk that drives our views. This is actually consistent with a lot of the personality research, where there seems to be kind of a baseline either personality level or perception of things more generally that people seem to move off of and can regress back to over time. I think this is actually a good thing, because what it means is if we can figure out how to move the needle on this, then people aren't going to like bounce back. They're not going to hold variation for other things. So if we can move the needle on one perception, it might move all the others. That's a hypothesis. That's an assumption, but it suggests that it's not easy to do this, but we don't have to change people's perceptions for every single crime. Like if we can just kind of generally get them to think about one or two crimes, it might move their perception for everything. The age grade hypothesis, we did see at the population level slight increases with that small positive coefficient. What that means is the adolescent peak in crime is not simply attributable to youth ignorance, that they think that you're not going to get in trouble. They thought they stayed stable. They thought they were going to get in trouble at 18, and they didn't change much. So if we want to change crime rates by changing perceptions, what this means is that we're probably going to have to, if we figure out how to move these, then we're going to have to move them for younger people. Because the older we get, it doesn't seem like there's not at least, naturally, there's not much change. Which means if you're a politician, this is going to be really hard because you're going to have to bank on that my changes are going to take, 20 years to show up. So that's not going to be a very popular policy stance. Cost risk hypothesis people do. We saw some indication that people can update their perceptions with life when life circumstances change. So if we can raise the awareness of the cost of crime, we might get a little bit of return in the perceptions of the risks of crime. But it might be a transitory effect that, that time varying effect that could come and go. And then lastly, we said people seem to update their perceptions, increase their risk, their perceived risk when they get arrested. Which then brings me back to that first study, and then that'll kind of be where we stop. Are these contradictory now? So we had seen if you get arrested in the first study, then you do more crime later, which would suggest maybe that means we're lowering your perception of risk, the gambler's fallacy. But here we're saying if you get arrested, it raises your perception. Now, these are two different data sets, could just be two different variation in samples from across the world over time. Or and this was kind of by accident that I found this. This is post hoc. This is not a priori. But I did notice what you're seeing here on the x-axis is the correlation essentially, or the effect of conviction on perceptions of risk broken down by phase. And so at phase 18, the effect was actually negative. And then phase 21, we started to see that experiential hypothesis being supported. The coefficient turns positive. It got stronger, positive 26, and kind of stayed stable at phase 38. If you remember our first study, they were 18 roughly when we studied them. This is post hoc. It could just be chance. And this was not statistically significant. You see the error bar crossing zero here. But I think it's suggestive actually, and may actually lend a little bit of credence to that there could still be a variation that we can influence in those early years, those first 2 decades of life, because the effects of conviction on your perceptions is still changing. It is potentially changing over time. And so I took this as at least a little bit of a glimmer of hope that there might, if we could figure out exactly what it is that can move the needle on these things, we might actually still be able to affect it with policy or with changes in the system. So finally, what we still don't know from this is where these perceptions actually come from. We didn't find a whole lot of evidence of it. And when you're studying at age 18, it's likely that these are forming much earlier than that. And this is actually what I've got one of my students doing now for his dissertation. So that was what I pointed out earlier, that all that variation at age 18. And so this is just a plug that I'd love to come back, and in a couple of years, maybe I can tell you about that then, to a new building. I'd love to open the new building. So lastly, I'd just like to point out and say thank you to all the people. This is just some of the people that work on these studies that we owe a debt of gratitude. So the colleagues that I work with at Duke, who kind of the thought leaders for this. This is the team of researchers that collected data on the twin sample. And this is the team of researchers at age 38 for the Dunedin study. So you can see like the village that it takes to actually pull off a study like this. So each one of these people are to be thanked for this. And that is all I have for you. Thank you.
That will be questions in the room first, and then we'll see if there are any on Zoom.
I'll quit
Any
sharing.
questions from the room? I see Joe has one.
Yes.
It was a great talk. This was great.
Thank you.
Doing it.
Yeah.
I was curious how you think about like situational nature of funding, like
Mhm.
complicate these results. Like we know that I don't like I don't know if I'll call this, but I'm gonna call it the basketball hypothesis.
Oh, I don't know this. So explain that
Oh,
hypothesis.
well, it's just the idea, right? Like, McLean Osgood talked about
Mhm.
this, where like, right, crime amongst youth is like a game of pickup basketball, right? It's like a bunch of kids get together and it just happens.
Yeah. Okay. I like that.
It doesn't necessarily have all the actors
Mhm.
together, emerge.
Yes.
And so I often think about that when reading these sorts of things.
Mhm.
How do you think that kind of complicates this picture of like, right, this very individualized model where everybody has like their own perception of risk and then we update it rationally, irrationally, and et cetera. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I love this question. I love that metaphor too. I had not read that, so that makes a lot of sense. I think it complicates it, but it also, this is just all off the cuff. So I think it complicates, but it also might be that it encourages us to think about these things as quite a little bit of separate phenomena. So the complications, I think, are all the things that you can immediately see. What it's saying is maybe our perceptions are quite malleable, and they're potentially quite malleable based on the context and the people that we're involved with. I think that's likely true to some extent. Or if we don't actually change our perception of risk, we might be quite suggestive to, well, if the risk is now worth it. So either the gains become more malleable, or those costs potentially become more malleable. And I'm not sure if there's any, this is more a question for the group. I'm not sure if there's much, if any, research that would help us unpack that. So that's really interesting. I think, so I kind of actually hit on what I was thinking of, the second thing too, that it could be that it's maybe not changing our perception of risk, but maybe it's changing our perceptions of the other things. And so you could think about, like, what is it about peer offending that makes it so much more likely that you do something in the presence of peers versus alone? And there's all that, all the things, all the pressures of peer influence, everything that we could think of. I mean, I did some really dumb stuff as a 17-year-old that I would never have done alone and would not do now with those same people if they still wanted to do it. So yeah, I think that's a great. I didn't really answer your question,
No.
but other than to say, I think you're right that it definitely complicates it. Yeah.
My question is kind of building on that. So it could be a situational thing, but it could also be perhaps a peer effect or even a larger contextual effect. I wonder, I noticed that you have a delinquent peers. I'm curious sort of how you enter that into it. But my first thing, what I would look into, for example, where someone commits a crime before or at 18 within a peer context, it's possible their peer context, maybe they get protected, but their peers don't. So I think if you have a cost analysis relative to the peers, the fact that their detection is going down after their risk assessment goes down after detection may be a function of their peer
Yes.
calculation, balancing that, maybe even a higher environment. Whereas when they're at the later stages, their peer circle changed. I'm
Yeah.
curious if you're accounting for that. And then similar to that is basically, it does sound like you have a really cool data set where you could assess whether the movement from a location to another may make a difference.
Oh
Maybe
yeah,
factor in.
yeah. Interesting. I had not thought about that either. Yeah.
It could be the movement per
that's a great
se,
point.
maybe they're moving away on purpose from a particular risk circle.
Absolutely.
Or
And
maybe
we do have that kind of information. Yeah.
And also they're moving into a new environment where the clearance risk may be different locally or even globally.
Yeah, I had not thought about that. Similarly, though, I was fortunate enough to give this same talk over the summer to some colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and one of the guys over there suggested, he's like, well, you also have to keep in mind that the actual risk might have changed over time, and especially for some of them, like shoplifting. You think about all the theft and kind of fraud limitation measures that we've implemented as a society over the last 20 years. So it could be that they would have changed, but maybe they got some interesting kind of overtime interactions there. Didn't take, that'd be hard, but that would all be complicated in here too. So just one second. I'm going to try and remember all the things that what you were saying made me think of. All those really great ideas. We did have the peer delinquency items here that I wanted to point out. We didn't control for them. Nothing was significant. They were always consistently negative. So more your peers, higher level of delinquency, it's slightly lower perceptions of risk, which makes sense. So consistent across both levels. I will admit that this is a little bit of a stretch to call this pure delinquency. It's a very liberal interpretation of delinquency. It's not our kind of standard, how we would have measured it as criminologists. I think it taps into like classroom misbehavior at age 18 and drug use and some other like really minor things. So it's not a great measure of pure delinquency. So I wouldn't put a whole lot of emphasis on it.
Cost to friends is actually capturing the.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, could be.
I'm just gonna tag on it for 1 second, then I know we have a question over there. So this makes me think about Jimmy Fader's book, Falling Back with the coming back to Philadelphia, and how like her interviews with him, they'll be like, well, I got caught because I was stupid. I was dealing drugs here, but my friend was doing it from his friend's apartment and he didn't get caught. So it could just be like you think they're invincible. It's like, okay, I did something. I made a mistake. That's what I got caught. Next time I'll be smarter.
Yes, yeah.
And not get caught. So
Right.
it's like a little tag on.
Yeah, I think so, and that actually plays into another thought that came to mind. A couple things that have come up is, I think I think when I'm putting all this together, I still feel like I come back to that baseline perceived risk. I don't think perceptions of risk is completely absent. I think we do have some inherent perception of risk. I don't think that's all that controversial. Well, what we're trying to sort out, you know, as a group in this conversation in this paper, like where is the variation just random or is there some meaning to it? And I think and then we apply it to these other contexts, like the pickup basketball game metaphor, for example, that then makes me think, okay, is it that we then drastically or dramatically change our perceptions in the moment, or do we just suspend them in the moment? You know, like kind of put them to the side and say, I'm going to ignore all these internal signals that are going off telling me this is a bad idea. And I don't know how you would necessarily test that without kind of minute to minute physiological type of data. But therefore I'm not so sure that I think these two ideas are compatible in that sense. It's like these are still real and they kind of guide our day-to-day behavior, but in any given moment, the emotion or all everything that takes over could still somebody could be extremely risk averse and still do something crazy, if the conditions were right. Yeah. Which makes our job really hard. and the policing. So I think I hit most of yeah, great.
I have a question here, then I want to turn to see if there's anything that's Zoom.
There's nothing on Zoom, but it is past one.
Okay,
great.
Oh, yeah, my original one was, when you mentioned somewhere in the talk, someone was talking about how perception of risk for certain types of crimes may have changed over time.
Yes, yeah.
And so I was wondering if you ever tried to do some sort of like, difference in difference analysis prior to this to see if like actually test for that. Like at time points where certain policy changes were introduced.
Yeah.
And then the new thing that came up when I was hearing y'all talk was, I know you said that you have this really novel measurement for self-perception, where it was the self-perception of like how you think you do, what was it, less crime than your peers?
Yep.
So I think using that, you can potentially find a way to motivate it with the peer delinquency and like also contextual moving, like those three factors can maybe touch at potential variation in terms of like how like I'm guessing this is touching into like learning, hearing and things like that, like differences in differential association. We just learned that in health class. But
yeah, so those are great ideas and I have not thought about most of that. The differences I'd want to think about whether, so mechanically could you do it? Yes, I'd want to think about like whether it'd be could we draw any meaning from it? Given that like this is a really I gush about this data set, I think it's amazing, but it's not, it's still 1,000 people, it's not huge, and 4 time points isn't a lot for these. So I'd want to think about that kind of stuff. But this is a little bit of a sidestep, but because they don't have the measures about perceptions, but New Zealand is one of the few countries in the world, like Scandinavian countries have these population registries. And so you can't do quite this, but you can, they do have these massive data files on everyone in the country for things like their involvement in crime, their employment histories. And so you can get, depending on what you're asking, you know, in New Zealand, and you have to go there to analyze the data, which is, you know, oh man, right? So, so we are going to go back in the spring, our spring, their fall, to do that, and studying some policy shifts, and we're proposing a difference design there. That one's really, it has nothing to do with this. It's actually, they're the only country in the world to have fully legalized and made it an actual employment code for prostitution. And we're interested to see what are the health impacts for women, mostly women, in that employment code. And so we're going to proposing to do something like you're talking about. So it's not quite this, like I said, a little bit of a sidestep, but thank you.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming. I forgot in my introduction to say that JC is the chair.
Oh,
of
yeah.
the Criminal Justice and Criminology in
Yeah.
Cincinnati, one of the top programs. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come visit us, and I hope you had a good visit, and everyone is thanking for him.
Thank you.